By the summer of 1944, German fighter pilots over Belorussia were given an order that no proud Air Force ever wants to put in writing. Do not fight it down low. If you see a small Soviet fighter with a clean nose, no scoop, no intake hanging under the engine, do not turn with it below 16,000 feet. Climb away. Run if you have to. Just do not get into a low knife fight with that airplane. That airplane was the Yakovlev Yak-3. It was tiny. It was light. It weighed only about 4,640 pounds empty, smaller than the Messerschmitt Bf-109, smaller than the Focke-Wulf FW-190, and in the thick, heavy air close to the ground, it could turn inside almost anything the Luftwaffe could throw at it. Over Belorussia, during the largest Soviet offensive of the entire war, this little fighter owned the sky. 8 of them once jumped 60 German aircraft and walked away without a scratch. So how did a stripped-down wooden Soviet fighter end up scaring the most experienced air force in the world into avoiding a fight? That is the story. It was 1941, and the Soviet Air Force was getting slaughtered. On the first morning of the German invasion alone, around 1,500 Soviet aircraft were destroyed, and most of them never left the ground. German bombers came in at first light and caught row after row of fighters parked wingtip to wingtip on their own airfields. By the time Soviet pilots understood what was happening, whole squadrons were already burning where they sat. The men who did claw their way into the air were flying machines that were slower, heavier, and clumsier than the German fighters hunting them. A Soviet pilot in those early days had short odds and a short life. Picture that for a second. The biggest air force in the world, gutted in a matter of hours. Its planes turned into scrap metal before a single one fired a shot. That was the hole the Soviets had to climb out of. And the man who would help dig them out had been wrestling with the exact problem that put them there. Alexander Yakovlev was one of the men trying to fix that. He was a Soviet aircraft designer, and he already had a fighter in service, the Yak-1. It was decent. It was not a killer. And Yakovlev knew exactly why. It was too heavy, and it carried too much drag for the engine it had. So he did something that sounds almost too simple to work. He started cutting weight. Everywhere. He took the Yak-1, and he attacked it like a man trimming fat off a blade. He shrank the wing, dropping it from about 185 square feet down to roughly 160. He cut the fuel he carried. He cleaned up the airframe and reworked the joints and panels so the air slid over the skin instead of dragging against it. He pulled out anything that did not earn its place. The plane kept a mixed body of wood and metal, which mattered in a country short on aluminum, and Yakovlev leaned into that instead of fighting it. When the numbers came back, the difference was real. The Yak-1 came in around 5,300 pounds empty. The new fighter dropped to about 4,640. That is roughly 600 pounds gone off a fighter that was already light. And on an airplane that small, 600 pounds is the difference between turning with the enemy and turning a half-second too late. The result was a fighter that weighed less than its rivals, but kept a strong engine. The Klimov VK-105 family power plant that the Soviets could build in huge numbers. By the time it reached the Yak-3, that engine was pushing close to 1,300 horsepower. Less weight, same muscle. That ratio of power to weight is the whole secret of this airplane. It is why everything that comes later happened. But in 1941, none of that existed yet. It was just an idea in a designer's head, while the front was collapsing. And the road from that idea to a finished killing machine would take 3 brutal years. There is something most people miss about the Yak-3. It was not built to be the best fighter in the world at every height. Yakovlev made a choice, and it was a ruthless one. Air combat on the Eastern Front did not look like the air war over Germany. Over Belorussia, fighters were not climbing to 30,000 feet to escort heavy bombers across the continent. There were no 1,000 bomber raids to defend against here. The planes that mattered were down low, in the dirt, covering tanks and infantry, and the ground attack aircraft hammering enemy columns. The fight that decided who lived on the ground was the fight a few thousand feet over their heads. That engine choice tells you everything about the plan. The Klimov was tuned for low and medium altitude. Its real strength sat down around 13,000 feet and below. Send it up into the high, thin air, and it started to wheeze. A German pilot in a Bf-109 could climb above that ceiling and look down on it. But the Soviets had asked a simple question. Why would we ever go up there? Nothing we care about is up there. So Yakovlev built a plane that was a monster exactly where the Eastern Front fought, and he accepted that it would give up some performance way up high, where the Soviets rarely needed it anyway. Below about 13,000 feet, the Yak-3 was lethal. It could outturn, outclimb in short bursts, and outmaneuver the German fighters it met. Up high, it was merely good. But the Luftwaffe over Belorussia could not pick the fight up high. The war was happening down low, and down low belonged to the Yak. The top speed tells the same story. The Yak-3 could hit around 407 miles per hour at about 10,000 feet, and roughly 401 miles per hour a little higher up. Fast, but not record-breaking. Speed was never the point. The point was that in a turning fight close to the ground, this airplane could put its nose on a German pilot before he could put his nose on it. And in a dogfight, that is everything. It carried a real punch too. One 20mm cannon firing through the propeller hub, backed by a pair of heavy 50 caliber class machine guns up front. That cannon round was the heavy hitter. A short squeeze of the trigger, and you were sending a stream of explosive shells straight down the line of the engine. No need to lead the target sideways, the way wing guns force you to. That was enough to tear a Bf-109 apart in a couple of seconds. Light, fast turning, and hard hitting. A nightmare to fight. Now, the designers and test pilots loved it, but a fighter does not earn its reputation in a factory. It earns it in front of the guns. And the place where the Yak-3 was about to make its name was already being chosen. A patch of sky over Belorussia, the summer of 1944. For the Soviet command, the summer of 1944 was the moment to break the back of the German army in the east. The operation was called Bagration, and it ran from late June into August of 1944. The goal was simple to say and staggering to do: drive the Germans out of Belorussia entirely. The numbers behind it are hard to even picture. The Soviets massed somewhere over 2 million men for this one push. They brought more than 5,000 tanks and assault guns. They lined up tens of thousands of artillery pieces, so many that in some sectors the guns stood almost wheel to wheel. And they put up around 5,000 aircraft to cover all of it. On the other side stood German Army Group Center, a little over 1 million men, holding a line that was about to be hit by the heaviest hammer the Red Army had ever swung. It would become one of the largest offensives in the history of warfare. And over all of it, the air had to be controlled. You cannot run an offensive that size while enemy fighters and dive bombers are picking apart your tanks from above. One Ju-87, loose over a stalled tank column, could turn a breakthrough into a graveyard in minutes. Somebody had to clear the sky and keep it clear. That job, in part, fell to the Yak-3. The aircraft was so new that it was still being combat tested when Bagration began. One of the first units to take it into real fighting was the 91st Fighter Regiment, which put the Yak-3 through its service trials in June and July of 1944, right as the offensive kicked off. So picture that, a brand new fighter, barely out of testing, handed to a single regiment and thrown straight into the biggest battle on the continent. There was no quiet stretch of front to ease it in, no months of working out the bugs against weak opposition. The Yak-3's first real classroom was a sky full of German aircraft over the most important offensive of the year. And the airplane did not just pass, it dominated. By the way, if you are into the machines that actually decided the Eastern Front, the real weapons behind the headlines, subscribe to the channel. We go deep on the iron that won and lost this war, one weapon at a time. So here is where things get interesting. Let us get to the day that made the legend. On the 17th of July, 1944, a group of just 8 Yak-3 fighters ran into a German formation of about 60 aircraft. 60. That is, dive bombers and their fighter escort, a wall of German air power against 8 small Soviet fighters. On paper, 8 against 60 is not a fight. It is a funeral, and the funeral is for the 8. That is not what happened. The Yak-3s went in. Think about the math those 8 pilots were staring at. Every one of them had roughly 7 or 8 enemy aircraft to worry about, and somewhere in that swarm were experienced German fighter pilots who had been killing for years. The smart move, the safe move, was to stay high, make one slashing pass, and dive away. Instead, the Yaks took it down into the low air where their plane was strongest and forced the Germans to fight on Soviet terms. And in the fight that followed, they shot down 3 Ju-87 dive bombers and 4 Bf-109G fighters. 7 German aircraft knocked out of the sky. And the cost to the Soviets? Nothing. Not one Yak-3 lost. 8 Soviet fighters tangled with 60 German planes and came home with everyone, having torn 7 of the enemy down on the way. Read that again. Outnumbered better than 7 to 1, and they did not lose a single aircraft. That kind of result does not happen because of luck. It happens because the German pilots, even good ones, simply could not get the Yak-3 to sit still in their sights down low. Every time they tried to turn with it, the little fighter turned tighter. Every time they tried to climb away and come back, the Yak was already inside the move. A German pilot in a turning fight near the deck would haul his Bf-109 around as hard as it would go, glance back, and find the Soviet fighter had already cut the corner and was sliding onto his tail. The Germans were flying fine aircraft. They were just flying them in the one part of the sky where the Yak-3 was king. And this was not a one-time fluke. In another action that same July, a larger group of Yak-3s, around 18 of them, ran into roughly 30 German fighters. When it was over, 15 German aircraft had been shot down. The Soviet loss? A single Yak-3, 15 for 1. And notice the matchup this time. These were not slow dive bombers caught out of position. These were German fighters, 30 of them, plane against plane, the fairest fight the Luftwaffe could ask for. And the Yak-3 still walked away 15 to 1 ahead. Those are the kinds of numbers that change how an entire air force behaves. And that is exactly what happened next. When you lose 7 planes to 8 enemy fighters and 15 to a single flight of Yaks, word travels fast. German pilots started reporting the same thing over and over. There is a small Soviet fighter down low that we cannot beat in a turning fight. It was not one squadron's bad luck. It was a pattern, and the men flying against it could feel it in every fight. And so, according to the accounts that come down to us, the Luftwaffe did something extraordinary. They put out an order. Now, this part lives in secondary sources, the lore that gets passed down through the histories, so treat it as the story as it has been told rather than a document you can hold. But the order, as it is remembered, told German pilots to avoid combat below 5,000 meters, which is about 16,400 feet, with any Yakovlev fighter that lacked the oil cooler intake under the nose. Stop and think about what that order actually means. The most battle-hardened fighter force in the world, the air force that had rolled over half of Europe, that had shot the early Soviet Air Force out of the sky in a single morning back in 1941, was now telling its own pilots not to fight a specific enemy plane in a specific part of the sky. That is not a tactical note. That is a confession. And the detail about the oil cooler intake is the part that makes the whole thing feel real. On earlier Yakovlev fighters, there was a scoop, an intake, hanging down under the nose to feed the oil cooler. It was easy to spot. A little chin sticking out below the propeller. The Yak-3 had been cleaned up so thoroughly that this scoop was tucked away, and the nose underneath looked smooth and bare. So the recognition cue for German pilots was the clean nose. If you saw a Yak with nothing hanging under the engine, that was the dangerous one. That was the one you did not turn with down low. Imagine being a young German pilot getting that briefing. You have maybe a handful of combat missions behind you. You are scared already, and the man in front of you is telling you to study the chin of the enemy's aircraft, and if it is clean, if there is no scoop under the nose, You break off below 16,000 feet. You give up the airspace. You let him have it. The Yak-3 was winning fights before its guns even fired, just by being recognized through a gun sight. That is what owning the sky actually looks like, not just shooting planes down, but making the enemy decide in advance that he will not even try. For the men on the ground during Bagration, this was everything. With German fighters pulling away from low-altitude fights, Soviet ground attack planes could work over the German columns without being jumped. The IL-2 Sturmovix could come in low and slow over a packed road and do their worst, because the fighters that should have been guarding that road had been told to stay up high or stay home. Soviet tanks could roll forward without dive bombers screaming down on them every hour. The air over Belorussia was being swept clean, and the Yak-3 was a big part of the broom. And the offensive did not just push the Germans back, it shattered them. Army Group Center, 1 million strong, was torn apart. Dozens of German divisions were wiped out or rendered useless. It was one of the worst defeats in German military history, a hole the Wehrmacht in the east never climbed out of. And one of the reasons the men below could keep moving was that the sky above them had been taken away from the enemy. But the Yak-3 story has one more chapter that almost sounds made up, because some of the most famous pilots to fly it over the Eastern Front were not Soviet at all. They were French. There was a fighter unit on the Eastern Front made up of French pilots flying for the Soviet cause, the Normandy-Neman Regiment. These were Frenchmen who had refused to accept that their country was finished. When France fell, they did not put down their weapons. They found their way out, and instead of fighting in the West, they ended up thousands of miles east on the Russian front, flying Soviet fighters against the Luftwaffe alongside their Soviet comrades. They learned to fly Soviet planes, live in Soviet conditions, and fight a Russian winter that was nothing like home. In late 1944, the Normandy-Neman re-equipped with the Yak-3. They were handed the same lethal little fighter the Soviets had been using to terrorize German pilots over Belorussia. And these French pilots took to it like they were born in it. After flying older types, getting into the light, sharp-turning Yak-3 was like trading a truck for a race car, and they used it exactly the way it was meant to be used. Down low, turning hard, getting in close and firing. Over the course of the war, the regiment was credited with a total of 273 air victories. And here is the detail that tells you what the Yak-3 meant to them. Of those 273 kills, the final 99, the last 99 victories of the entire war, came on the Yak-3. Nearly 100 enemy aircraft downed in the closing stretch of the war, all on the type that the Germans had been ordered to avoid. Think about that arc. French pilots, driven out of their own country, flying a Soviet fighter, scoring nearly 100 of their final kills on a plane that the German Air Force was scared to fight at low altitude. The Yak-3 did not just serve the Soviets, it became a weapon for anyone willing to take it down into the dirt and turn. By the end, the regiment had produced multiple aces and 4 men honored as heroes of the Soviet Union, the highest award the country could give. Frenchmen, wearing that Soviet star, having earned it in the cockpit, and the airplane under them, when they did their deadliest work, was the Yak-3. So how does a small wooden fighter end up as one of the most respected aircraft of the entire war? It comes back to that one ruthless choice Yakovlev made years earlier, while the Soviet Air Force was still smoldering on its own runways. He did not try to build a plane that was good at everything. He built a plane that was murder in the exact place the war was being fought. Down low, close to the ground, over the tanks and the trenches of the Eastern Front. He cut the weight until the airplane could dance, kept enough engine to make it fast where it mattered, and gave it a cannon hard enough to kill in a single pass. And the Luftwaffe, the same air force that had carved through Europe and gutted the Soviets in a morning back in 1941, looked at that little fighter over Belorussia and blinked. They told their own men to back off, to check the enemy's nose and refuse the fight if it was clean. There is no higher compliment one Air Force can pay another machine than that. The Yak-3 did not win the war by itself. No single weapon does. But in the summer of 1944, over a stretch of sky that mattered enormously, 8 of them faced 60 and came home whole. 18 of them traded 15 for 1. French exiles rode it to nearly 100 final kills, and an entire enemy air force decided that some fights were not worth having. That is what it means to own the sky. Not the most famous fighter of the war, not the fastest, but for one brutal summer over Belorussia, in the only part of the air that counted, it was the one nobody wanted to meet. If you want more like this, the weapons that really decided the Eastern Front, the iron behind the headlines. There is another breakdown waiting for you on screen right now. Go watch it, and subscribe so you do not miss the next one.